An original podcast from podlatino.com.
There's a pulse that doesn't ask for permission. It arrives without warning, settles into the body before the mind has time to process what's happening. And from that very first moment, it's already saying something. Not just inviting you to move, but pushing forward with a conviction that goes beyond dancing. The horns come in after, like a call, like an affirmation. The percussion holds, builds, insists. The guitar cuts at exactly the right moment. And together, they form something that doesn't feel like a group of instruments playing at the same time, but like a force that fills the air with a particular intention. That's what Afrobeat does from its very first note. It claims space, not requests it, claims it. To understand where that energy comes from, you have to go to a very specific time and place. Lagos, Nigeria, the late 1960s. A city growing without pause, overflowing with people arriving from different corners of the continent, shaped by an intense cultural mix and by a political tension that had no easy way out. Nigeria had recently gone through independence from British colonial rule, but formal freedom hadn't brought justice or equality along with it. The governing elites were reproducing many of the same power structures that were supposedly left behind. Corruption was visible, repression was every day, and in that context, music stopped being just entertainment and became something far more urgent. What eventually came to be called Afrobeat didn't emerge from nothing or from a single brilliant mind. It emerged from an encounter. From a city that already had its own deeply rooted musical traditions, particularly highlife, a popular style in West Africa that blended local melodies with European brass instrumentation, and had been the definitive social music in Ghana and Nigeria for decades. That highlife was in the bones of the people who began building Afrobeat. But other influences had also arrived from across the Atlantic. American funk, with its obsession with groove and timing, jazz with its improvisational freedom, and its long tradition of saying things through music that couldn't always be said in words. Those currents didn't arrive as an imposition, but as working material, as tools that could be used from an African perspective without abandoning the root. The result was a music that didn't fit neatly into any of those previous categories. Denser than highlife, more political than commercial funk, more collective than jazz in its more individual forms. And with something that made it unmistakable from the very first bar, the rhythm wasn't a foundation for the other instruments to rest on. It was the central argument, the starting point and the destination. In Afrobeat, the rhythm doesn't accompany, it constructs. And it does so in a way that has very deep roots in the musical traditions of West Africa, where percussion doesn't just serve a rhythmic function, but carries meaning, history, and community. There's something specific about the way Afrobeat treats musical time that separates it from almost everything else. Repetition, which in other traditions can feel like filler or like a way to hold things together while something else happens, is here the primary mechanism. A rhythmic pattern that repeats doesn't lose power with each cycle, it accumulates it. There's an idea rooted in African ceremonial and ritual music that repetition isn't circular but spiral. You return to the same point but at a different level, with more weight, with more presence. That's what Afrobeat does when a rhythmic cell extends for several minutes without dramatic variation. It's not waiting for something else to arrive. It's building something that can only be built with time and with insistence. The trance isn't an accident, it's the intention. But that trance isn't escapism, and there lies one of Afrobeat's most productive tensions. A music that hypnotizes with its pulse, that moves the body in a way that's nearly impossible to resist, that generates a collective energy rarely reproduced anywhere else, is also a music that speaks. The lyrics of classic Afrobeat don't talk about romantic love or uncomplicated celebration. They talk about institutional corruption, about colonialism that didn't end with formal independence, about African identity under threat, about the relationship between local elites and foreign interests, about the dignity of ordinary people living outside the halls of power. That criticism isn't hidden or abstract, it's direct, forceful, sometimes fierce, and it coexists with the groove in a way that weakens neither one. The music doesn't lose energy by being political, and the message doesn't lose force by being wrapped in something that makes you dance. That coexistence wasn't accidental. It came from a deep understanding of how music functions in many African traditions, where the separation between art and social life, between celebration and reflection, between body and mind, doesn't carry the same weight as in other cultures. Music wasn't just an aesthetic product, it was part of the social fabric, part of the way the world was processed collectively. Urban Afrobeat picks up that inheritance and carries it into a modern, electric, amplified setting. It takes it and turns it into something that can circulate, that can resonate in the working neighborhoods of Lagos, but also reach much further. The band, in that context, isn't just a group of musicians, it's a social figure, a community in motion. Afrobeat isn't music for a soloist backed by a background. It's music where every instrument fulfills a precise function within a collective structure. The percussion sections interact with each other. The horns work as a single block that breathes together. The guitar and the bass create a rhythmic and harmonic texture that can't easily be pulled apart into separate pieces. All of that requires a level of coordination and mutual listening that turns each performance into something that can only exist in that moment, with those people, with that shared energy. There's something deeply democratic in that structure, even though it also emerged in contexts where the figure of the musical leader was strong and visible. Afrobeat also had to survive, and that word isn't metaphorical. In Nigeria, through decades of military governments, making critical music was literally dangerous. Artists who named what was happening, who pointed directly at what the controlled press couldn't report, paid very real prices. Censorship, forced closures of cultural spaces, persecution, exile. The Shrine, that iconic venue in Lagos that functioned as a club, a school, a community, and a political platform all at once, was shut down by authorities more than once. That the music survived all of that, and that it continued to be heard and defended, says something about the strength it had, not just as an artistic product, but as a collective project. Over time, Afrobeat found listeners in very different places. Not immediately or in massive numbers, but with a consistency that built a solid legacy. In Europe and in the Americas, it began circulating among musicians who recognized in that groove something that didn't exist in their own traditions, in the same way. Funk had some of it, jazz had parts of it, but not with that specific rhythmic density, not with that structure of accumulative repetition, not with that political weight, so explicit and so integrated into the sound. Afrobeat became a reference point for musicians across very different genres, from the most experimental rock to electronic music, through hip-hop and through styles that didn't even have names yet when the first recordings began moving around the world. Toward the end of the 20th century, and with even more force in the 21st, the term Afrobeats, with that added plural, began naming something different but related. A new generation of African musicians, many with connections to the diaspora in Europe and in the Americas, took the pulse of the original Afrobeat, crossed it with contemporary sounds, made it shorter and more accessible without losing its identity. Artists from Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and many other points across the continent began placing African music on global popularity charts, not as an exotic curiosity, but as a serious proposition, with world-class production and an impact that could no longer be ignored. That new scene has direct debts to what was built in Lagos in the 1970s, even though it's also a different animal, more hybrid, more connected to the immediate present. But beyond genres and labels, what Afrobeat installed in the history of music has to do with something deeper than any recognizable style. It proved that groove can be a form of thought, that a rhythm that never stops doesn't have to be shallow, that repetition can make an argument, that collective energy can be political, that the body that's dancing can also be listening to something that matters. Afrobeat didn't separate those things. It fused them in a way that turned out to be as natural as it was powerful. And that fusion is its most lasting legacy, far more than any specific recording or any particular moment in its history. Today, Afrobeat is still beating, in the rhythms of artists who never set foot in Lagos but learn to listen carefully to what comes from there. In the producers who understand that the pulse isn't a background but an architecture. In the urban scenes across the African continent that keep building from that tradition without needing anyone's permission to do so. Groove has a conscience. That's not a slogan. It's a description of what music can do when it refuses to accept that the body and the mind are separate things.